Hello everyone, welcome to my last video in my series, Comprehending Consciousness. This is the fourth part of my series, but the links to the first three parts are in the description box. Here I will be discussing the development of the given from proto-conceptual capacities as outlined in the Carus lectures of the philosopher Wilfrid Sellars. These lectures are also linked in the description box. I will then explain the myth of Jones and the origin of the theoretical framework that allows us to think about thinking. This video will explain the development of the given as well as wrap up the hard problem of consciousness. However, that part will be at the end. Carus lectures of Wilfrid Sellars go by the title Foundations for Metaphysics of Pure Process and consist of 3 lectures. The first one is called The Lever of Archimedes, so let us begin there. In 1981, Wilfrid Sellars' Carus lectures were published. This was 25 years after his massive paper, Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind, or EPM. His Carus lectures are a summation of some of the afterthoughts he had regarding his work on the myth of the given. Sellars says, "Fortunately, for my peace of mind, if nothing else, these afterthoughts invariably turned out to be variations on the original theme." Sellars starts out revamping his ideas by strongly concurring with an essay by the Harvard philosopher Roderick Firth, titled Coherence, Certainty, and Epistemic Priority. The link to this paper is also in the description box. In Firth's analysis of the coherence theory of concepts, he says that philosophers such as David Lewis and John Locke have previously assumed that looks talk, i.e. looks read, is epistemically prior to is talk, i.e. is read. Firth instead says that looks read is a tacit comparison to something that is read, and thus looks talk is parasitic on is talk. That is to say that describing how something looks is tacitly driven by an attempt to articulate what something is. Firth writes, "It is these expressive judgments, according to Lewis, that enable us to escape the coherence theory of justification, and if it should turn out that these judgments all make some covert reference to physical objects, then, depending on the kind of covert reference, it might no longer be possible to make the epistemological distinction which Lewis requires." Firth notes that a child in her early development is first committed to is talk, as it draws no distinction that would allow for contrast. When it is able to recall a past memory of what something is in order to make a perceptual judgment about how something looks. For grown-ups to say that O looks green to little Max would be to, in Firth's words, baptize little Max's sense experience, as the grown-ups are using phrases that express concepts that little Max does not possess. As Firth puts, the distinction between looks read and is read would be required once the child learns how to distinguish normal and abnormal conditions regarding perception. In interpreting Firth, Sellars notes how the environment would shape the child's concepts of, for example, being white, of something being white. For example, in a stable environment where colors don't change much, a child's concept of something being white might acquire a predictive component. This would lead to a new level of givenness that we could perhaps call the predictive given. However, in an unstable environment, at least chromatically unstable, such a concept might not even arise. If the child was ignorant of the effect of lighting on the colors reflected by objects, she might not make a judgment about an apparent change that had taken place. She would have to be taught the exception, much like Moyra in this previous installment in my series.
This little girl is 2.5 years old. Moyra lives in a peaceful suburb in New Jersey.
I'm gonna go ladder.
Goodbye.
Like all toddlers, she is learning a staggering 10 new words a day.
It did seem quite quick.
that she was able to communicate or to describe things in detail. It seemed really fast. Thank you. At one point, you think that she's able to just sort of react with words, and then it's amazing when she's able to take words and think about the future and what could be possible. You guys, do you know what this is over here? What do you think? What is it?
Turkey.
Very.
Turkey.
Yeah? You like turkeys? Can you make the noise?
Gobble.
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 Moyra has never seen a baby deer before and doesn't know the word for it. This is the first time she will ever say it.
Do you know what to call one of these things? Well, some people call them Bambi, but that's after the movie, yeah? They're called a fawn. Can you say that word?
Fawn.
Fawn, yeah.
Not only is Moyra an enormous sponge soaking up new words, she knows automatically how to construct them into proper sentences. Children have an instinctive knack for language and get the grammar right virtually all the time. But their occasional mistakes are telling. It's almost always when the grammar is irregular.
Moyra, if I had one mouse and I had another mouse, I'd have two what?
Two mouses.
Two mouses? There's another word for the plural for mouse, isn't it? What is it? Do you remember? It'd be two.
Mice.
Two mice. That's right. Very good. Good job.
Sellars writes, but surely we might be inclined to say Junior has both the resources and the occasion to form the adult concepts looks see, is really see, and merely looks see, along the following lines. O presents me with a see experience. O looks see. O would present me with a see experience if looked at in white light, that is to say that O is really see. O presents me with a see experience, but would present me with an experience of another color if looked at in white light. O merely looks see. These are examples of cases where a concept can have multiple models of itself that all serve a purpose within a given context. That is to say that conceptualization is a dynamic and ongoing exercise. In the last video, I showed 4 levels at which perception can be given and gave examples where they are the highest form of givenness for some adults. I still maintain this view only to say that we can still possess all forms of the lower levels of givenness, which is a point that Firth makes and with which Sellars agrees. The necessity of certain levels of givenness is a product of the richness of one's conceptual environment, a fact that Firth says we often overlook. Sellars starts to slightly veer from the Firthian thesis about is-talk now. He says that the most epistemically prior judgment is talk. For Sellars, the concept of something being read refers to the experience of an expanse of read. Sellars writes, quote, if it is remembered that in this context read is equivalent to read stuff, it will be seen that what is at stake here is the Aristotelian distinction between a mere portion of matter and its material individual substance. In the child's proto-theory of the object, it is always volumes of color stuff which are objects by virtue of interacting with other objects in specific ways, and by so impinging on him that they are responsible for the fact that he comes to see them, unquote. Putting all this together, Sellars writes, Junior has a primal concept of volumes and expanses of red stuff. That's number 1. Number 2, Junior has a primal concept of seeing a volume of red stuff. Number 3, Junior has a primal concept of a physical object as an individuated volume of color stuff which is endowed with certain causal properties. Number 4, Junior has a primal concept of seeing a volume or expanse of red stuff, not only as a volume or expanse of red, but as a constituent of a physical object. Number 5, Junior has a primal concept of what it is to see of a physical object, a volume or expanse of red, which is one of its constituents, if the constituent is the surface of an opaque object, for example an apple, it is the very redness of the apple. And number 6, Junior has a primal concept of what it is to see the very redness of an object. Notice that the above primal concept of red is prior to the concept of a physical object being red, not in the sense that the redness of the physical object is defined in terms of the primal redness of something which is not a physical object, but in the sense that the concept of a red physical object is simply that of an individuated volume of red stuff which behaves in generically stuffy, as Sellars puts it, ways, and specifically in the manner characteristic of a determinate thing kind. Note, Sellars refers to these primal concepts as concepts. I just replaced the concept with primal concept simply to carry the intuition more forcibly. These concepts are simply those which are taken to be more conceptually basic than the sort of is-looks distinction. The next lecture in Sellars' Carus lectures is called Naturalism and Process. I won't say too much about this part except to say that Sellars goes on to describe the ontology of change and process by noting the connection between subjunctive conditionals and the properties of objects. He specifically gives the example of a water-soluble material having its aforementioned property exemplified by its behavior in water. Sellars' main contention here is that processes with subjects, like Qualia, need not have subjects as their ultimate substrate or foundation. For example, when we speak of a bee's buzz, it's mistaken to think that the buzz refers to a characteristic of the phenomenal experience of the sound we have. Rather, it is a reference to the manner in which that sound is produced. The buzzing is characteristic of the physical process, not the mental experience. Sellars writes, "There really are no events, for events are not basic items, atoms, in the furniture of the manifest image." This claim was supported by two lines of thought. A, we can always retreat from statements which involve event locutions and which ostensibly make a commitment to a domain of events as objects in the actual world. And B, since A by itself is compatible with the claim that it is events rather than things which are primary, the dominant consideration was, according to our analysis, that event locutions belong one step up the semantic ladder and refer to linguistic or conceptual items rather than to items in the world. The example Sellars gives of this sort of statement is a running by Socrates took place, contrasted with Socrates ran. In this way, regarding something like the musical note middle C, Sellars would say that the event of a middle C-ing is to be taken as a metalinguistic nominalization of the infinitive to middle C. This is a subtle point, but it is very crucial. It's the difference between saying there was a 5K and saying that people ran. If aliens came down and saw the Boston Marathon, they wouldn't see it as a marathon, they would just see people running. The conflation of events and processes is just another instance of the myth of the given. The assumption of the intentional structure in the analysis of the event itself. From here, Sellars crafts the intuition he's been trying to instill, that the world is described in terms of verbs and adverbs. The world is ultimately one of genuine, pure process. The world is made up of goings-on. However, Sellars notes there are constancies in the flux. It is these constancies onto which we latch when we develop our normative systems of perceptual categorization. The last part of Sellars' Carus lectures is called, Is Consciousness Physical? Sellars starts out by saying that what we have conventionally referred to as the mind-body problem is more adequately understood as the sensorium-body problem. This is more aptly understood as awareness as rather than simple awareness. Unsurprisingly, Sellars presents a valid distinction between perceptual awareness and conceptual awareness, a distinction that I explained in the 90-minute-long video about consciousness. The link to that video, like I said before, is in the description box. Sellars goes on to note the temptation to posit sense impressions of the manifest image as theoretical constructs and ascribe them to properties that make them out to be independently existing entities. This is a huge mistake. The purpose of inventing, or rather formulating, these predicates and properties is to explain their behavior. Sellars says, quote, "Might not this philosopher be led to admit that certain complex physicalistic attributes, roughly attributes definable in terms of primary qualities, might be both interestingly analogous to the perceptible features of the manifest objects and, when ascribed to sense impressions, satisfy the requirement of explanatory power, and also led to allow that the demand for a non-physicalistic attribute to play these roles might just be another example of pictorial thinking?" Unquote. Sellars notes that these sense impressions, quote, "are recategorized as sensory states of the perceiver and assigned various explanatory roles in the theory of perception," unquote. Here is where the error in thinking comes in. The redness of a red sensation is thought to be analogous to the redness of a tomato in the same way that the elasticity of a molecule is thought to be analogous to the elasticity of a tennis ball. However, this idea rests on the assumption that one can attribute properties to sense impression, qualia, if you like, that have explanatory power. In part 4 of this lecture, Sellars notes that the Cartesian picture of perception has sense impressions to be taken as properties of the perceiver. In this way, sensing the redness of a red tomato is caused by the reflection of electromagnetic radiation of approximately 633 nanometers. However, one objection to the Cartesian view is the question of why can't the perceiver attribute the redness to something that is inside the tomato, as a constituent of the tomato. The standard reply to this objection is that such properties would be causally epiphenomenal and thus would not play a role in the physical picture. The realism about qualia stems from a Lockean view of perception wherein color, shape, etc. are termed primary qualities. These qualities are structural and are thought to not exist apart from any content. This thesis mistakenly contributes the ideas that there are surfaces of red intrinsic to the physical makeup of a tomato. In part 5 of the Is Consciousness Physical lecture, Sellars does an analysis of various philosophical positions regarding the ontos, or essence, of sense impressions. The first position Sellars examines is substance dualism, which he calls substantial dualism. Here, the sensorium is taken to be a separate substance that is intimately related to the physical body, specifically the central nervous system. The image presented here clarifies Sellars' point succinctly, wherein the two components are the sensorium and the physical apparatus that is supposed to be the substrate of the sensorium. The second position Sellars examines is the reductive physicalist position. Sellars immediately highlights the problem with this position, which is that it is a categorization of a sense impression with explanatory attributes and properties, what Sellars calls pictorial thinking. The idea is that the thesis denies the influence of the external world on the existence of the sensory states. It becomes an attack on the idea of sense data. The position with which we are left is that of holistic or emergent materialism. This thesis states that a sense impression S is correlated but not reducible to a physical state P. This thesis is pictorially demonstrated in this diagram. Sellars goes on to a fourth position known as epiphenomenalism. You guys have probably heard it before, which is that sense particulars have now been replaced with sensoria and sense data. This position is like substantial dualism, save for the fact that it does not reify sense particulars as substances. This position is explained in the following diagram. The awareness of a cube of pink as a cube of pink is a product of the body in physical state P, or here sigma P, and the existence of a cube of pink external to the body system, the sensory system. But this thesis of epiphenomenalism has a few problems, as Sellars points out. What good is the postulation of sense particulars if they are causally inert? The following diagram shows us how physicality and mentality are connected in the epiphenomenalist scheme. The phi's represent the physical states, those are at the bottom, and the psi's represent the epiphenomenal sense particulars. The only nomologicals or underpinning laws of these sense particulars are the phi states. The diagram shows how the property of supervenience is described. This is similar to an argument put forth by the eminent Jaegwon Kim. Supervenience in this context is where mental properties, the psi's, are determined by underlying physical properties. This principle can be described in an equally effective way with the following pseudo-equations. Here you have a package of a physical state, a mental state at a particular time. So here you have physical state I and mental state I at time ti lead to physical state j and mental state j at time tj, which is equivalent to physical state I at time ti leading to mental state j at time tj, which is equivalent to physical state I at time ti leading to physical state j at time tj. What is the quantum mechanical bracket notation represent the composite states. The subsequent elision or deletion of the psi terms shows the causal inertness of sense impressions and mentality in general. The sixth part of this lecture, Sellars goes on to note how the name epiphenomenalism reiterates the causal impotence of the sense impressions. In the previous lecture on naturalism and process, Sellars sketched out how there need not be a sharp distinction between object and object-bound processes. This is true as long as one understands the relationship between physicality and mentality is one of constitution and not causation or identity. For example, what we call middle C in the Western tonal music system is constituted by acoustic pressure waves vibrating 261.6 times every second. In this way, mentality can be translated into the realm of absolute process. Here, we can posit the existence of psychophysical laws that map the environmental stimuli to mental states like the one we call middle C. However, we must be wary of the fact that even calling it middle C is already an exercise in the system of norms we use to classify monotonal sound in the first place. This system of norms is not universal. Sellars ends the lecture with the important insight that, quote, if it should turn out that particles, instead of being the primitive entities of the scientific image, could be treated as singularities in a space-time continuum which could be conceptually cut up without significant loss, in inorganic contexts at least, into interacting particles, then we would not be confronted at the level of neurophysiology with a problem of understanding the relation of sensory consciousness with its ultimate homogeneity to systems of particles. Rather, we would have the alternative of saying, although for many purposes the central nervous system can be construed without loss as a complex system of physical particles, when it comes to an adequate understanding of the relation of sensory consciousness to neurophysiological process, we must penetrate to the non-particulate foundation of the particulate image and recognize that in this non-particulate image, the qualities of sense are a dimension of natural process which occurs only in connection with those of complex physical process, which, when cut up into particles in terms of those features which are the least common denominators of physical process, as well as organic processes alike, become the complex system of particles which, in the current scientific image, is the central nervous system. What Sellars' Carus lectures tell us is that there need not be a sharp distinction between objects and the phenomena that are constituted by processes of those objects. I will wrap this section up at the end, but now onto the origin of our theoretical framework for understanding the mind. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle argues in his book, The Concept of Mind, that mind is, quote, a philosophical illusion hailing chiefly from René Descartes and sustained by logical errors and category mistakes which have become habitual, unquote. After much thought in writing and making this video, this is the view that I largely hold. Someone like Ryle and other proponents of what is called the theory hold to the idea that our mental states are theoretical constructs that we use to explain behavior. The problem with this idea becomes apparent when one considers the contextual aspect of our theoretical framework. For example, studies have been shown that the proficiency with which we attribute mental states to others has shown to be a function of the number of siblings one has. The link to that study is also in the description box, and more videos explaining the theory. However, this is really easy to see if we just take a step back and observe the fact that we can sometimes adopt cognitive frameworks without even fully realizing it. If you have ever watched a sad movie and cried, or a funny scene and laughed, then you are unconsciously attributing beliefs and desires to people you know are not real. In The Matrix, we attribute the mental state of being in love to Trinity and Neo. In a famous experiment by the psychologists Heider and Simmel, subjects who saw this video that I'm about to show to you describe the shapes in minded terms as if the shapes are conscious entities. And here's the video right now. The myth of Jones is a thought experiment proposed by Wilfrid Sellars. It is the concept of a prehistoric society that lacks any concept of internal mentality, qualia, beliefs, desires, etc. This society only talks about external behavior, not internal thoughts and qualities. Jones, a man amongst this tribe, comes across the fact that people can engage in intelligent behavior even while they are mentally silent. The idea is that Jones comes up with the concept of internal mentality that he calls inner episodes. These inner episodes are like inner conversations or inner talks. Jones passes this idea on to members of the society, and now the society has the concepts of wanting, desiring, and believing in explaining the behavior of people. These are called propositional attitudes. Over time, members of this tribe will have solidified into this framework such that it becomes given, and they make these assessments without even realizing it or understanding where they come from. The Cambridge professor of developmental psychopathology, Simon Baron-Cohen, has postulated the role of shared attention mechanisms wherein a child makes attributions of perceptual states and first-person perspectives to other people. This mechanism is supposed to account for folk psychology and the theoretical framework we have for understanding the minds of others as well as our own minds. This, I would say, could also be seen as the first affirmation of the Cartesian eye, as the idea of multiple different perspectives is brought into view to contrast with your own. For my conclusion, I would like to take the time to answer some questions I have been asked about consciousness. In my first video responding to Inspiring Philosophy, this was 2014, in January, the link to that is in the description box, I said, although I was not as articulate, that for a shark that has the electroreceptive sense that allows it to sense the electric fields generated by other organisms every time they move a muscle, the shark would probably come up with a scheme that allows it to classify different kinds of electroreceptive perception. However, it is just a scheme. There is nothing right or wrong or incorrect or intrinsic about that scheme. It's just a scheme. First question, How can one maintain scientific realism if committed to a view that the manifest image is illusory, since we only know about the outside world, the scientific image, by recourse to the manifest image? This is a very good question. In thinking about this question, I was actually reminded of the presuppositionalist question of side 10 Bruggencake.
Is it circular to use your reasoning to justify your reasoning?
The manifest image is not something of which I am denying the veracity. The manifest image is not a claim. The manifest image is to be thought of rather as a tool for understanding the external world. The consistency is in the scientific image. This goes back to the constancies in the flux that Sellars was talking about. As I have explained throughout this video, one can use the manifest image to sharpen his or her manifest image by training one's ears to the notes of various tonal music systems or tuning one's palates to the taste of foreign foods. When we talk about the properties of external world objects, we talk about the objects that are responsible for our manifest image. If you watch the second part of my series on materialism, you'll see that animals can sense things that we cannot. Their manifest image is different because of the differences in their cognitive faculties and, of course, their sensory organs. Our sensory perceptions are simply the way reality imposes itself on us, not in a way that would posit reality as an immediate given, hence following into, Sellars' myth, but in a way wherein we are stuck dealing with the reality we experience and coming up with ways to organize our perceptions. In the same way, Aristotle makes the distinction between how things are in themselves and how they are best known to us. For more on Sellars' scientific realism, a link to the Standards Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on this topic is in the description box as well. However, the important thing here is not to equate the order of knowing with the order of being. The second question, what is your direct response to Chalmers' formulation of the hard problem? My response is that there is no hard problem as Chalmers thinks. The assumption behind Chalmers' hard problem is that there is something intrinsic about experience. There isn't. In his essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat?, the philosopher Thomas Nagel baptizes the experience of a bat, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this video. The question of this paper only makes sense in light of Chalmers' assumptions about consciousness that he injects into his formulation of the hard problem. The problem with the Chalmersian and Nagelian understandings of consciousness is that they assume that experience can be captured or abstracted. Nagel baptizes the experience of a bat by trying to abstract it and understand it in his own terms. But Nagel isn't imagining what it's like to be a bat, he's imagining what it's like to have a bat's body but with a human's brain which is able to reflect on and conceptualize her experience of being a bat. Nagel is imagining a human-brained bat. More generally, when X tries to conceptualize what it's like to be a Y, X is not conceptualizing what it's like to be a Y, X is conceptualizing an X-brained Y. That is, a Y that has the brain of X, which allows it to conceptualize and reflect on the fact that it is a Y. However, an X-brained Y is not a Y. You can only experience something from your perspective. Trying to conceptualize any experience as an entity or an abstraction is misguided because experience is necessarily contextual to the experiencer. Chalmers' and Nagel's notions rely on an understanding of experience where experience, or qualia, is fundamentally decontextualized. Third question, why don't these processes or experiences simply happen, quote, in the dark? This is a very good question, and it goes back to the idea of givenness. But first of all, laden in the question is the assumption that all experience is fully given. As I made clear in my 90-minute video, there are different levels at which you can experience something. The change blindness example that I gave shows that for those who did not detect the change, the experience did occur, quote, in the dark. The experience is brought to light by your conceptual capacities at various levels. It is made to seem intrinsic based on our solidification into our conceptual schemes. That is to say that we take our theoretical frameworks for granted or as given. Of course, you can see that this is not the case simply by learning another language or training yourself in another scheme of norms whose purpose is to organize perception. It's counterintuitive to think about, but ask yourself, What does Gatorade taste like to a 2-month-old? The question is barely coherent. Experience doesn't just exist in a vacuum, as it is the product of many genetic and environmental forces at play. In either case, there is nothing it's like to experience X, whatever X might be. What we have are norms at work for understanding experience. More importantly, however, is that in the dark is a relative concept. The question assumes that our consciousness is the height, the pinnacle of all consciousness. It could be that there are higher evolved beings that have a givenness such that when they taste a tomato, they get a rush of memories of their past experiences with a tomato. To them, our experiences could be happening in the dark, in the same way that a rabbit's experiences are happening in the dark, at least compared to ours. It could be that their tasting an orange would stimulate not just their tongues, but also their eyes, ears, and skin temperature. The level of givenness does not just stop at human consciousness. The fourth question: do you think that qualia is a coherent concept at all? It depends on how people are using the word. A lot of the time, the notion of qualia relies on the idea that experience can be abstracted in such a way that it exists apart from a mind. Christian YouTuber Maximus Confesses, formerly Epicurus A. Greek, actually gave me an argument that pretty much clears this up. Premise 1. X is a quale if and only if X is a mind-dependent quality, color, sound, taste, etc. Premise 2. If qualia exist, then everyone's perception of them is different from the definition. Premise 3. Qualia exist, this is assumed for the reductio. Premise 4. If everyone's perception of qualia is different, we do not know if your perception is the same as mine. That is to say that there's no way to tell what it is like to experience in the same way as another, because those experiences are private as per Nagel. Premise 5. Everyone's perception of qualia is different. There is no way to universalize what it is like to experience in the same way as another. Premise 6. Qualia exist, and we do not know if your perception is the same as mine. The conclusion drawn from modus ponens in Premise 2, Premise 3, Premise 4, and Premise 5. Conclusion. Claims of qualia are either false or there is no fact of the matter. And this argument pretty much clears up the issue for me. The Hegelian and Chalmersian understandings of consciousness cut off any questions about consciousness from the very outset because they fall prey to the myth of the given and thus treat consciousness as foundational. The conception of consciousness laid out by Chalmers' hard problem makes it an unsolvable mystery from the outset. And, that's it. That's my view. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed these last 2 years with my videos on the subjects of mind and materialism. I'm now turning my attention towards the topics of morality, biblical criticism, Islam, and even politics. So expect more videos on those. I will also start making videos a bit more frequently now that I have this monster out of the way and I have more time. So thank you guys and gals so much for watching. Please like and share and stay tuned for more. Thanks.